Sarah's eyes flicked from Julia to Detective Harrow, then back again. Her jaw tightened, and for a moment, it seemed like she was weighing something, whether to speak, whether to leave. Sarah! Julia's voice broke as she tried to say her name, her throat tight. Sarah held up a hand, silencing her. I'm not here to talk about what happened, Julia, she said, her voice cold and controlled. I'm not here to rehash all the lies or the betrayal. I've seen enough. Julia flinched at the words. She could see the hurt in Sarah's eyes, the broken trust, and it felt like a punch to her gut. She wanted to apologize, to say something, anything, to make it better, but she couldn't find the right words. She couldn't fix this. Sarah's gaze shifted to Harrow. Detective, you should know something. I'm not just here for Julia. She stepped closer, her eyes sharp with intent. I'm here to make sure my father faces justice. Julia's stomach dropped. Sarah had to be talking about Victor, but Julia had no idea what she meant. After everything that had happened, Victor's arrest, the deaths, it felt like the world had tilted even more on its axis. But after everything, I've realized something, Sarah said, her voice low and cold. Victor wasn't just some confused man trying to survive. He wasn't just a broken person trying to hold his family together. He was behind it all. Everything. From the very beginning. Julia's pulse quickened. This wasn't just about their twisted affair anymore. This wasn't just about Sarah being hurt by her father's betrayal. No, Sarah was hinting at something far darker, something that Julia hadn't even considered. What are you talking about? Julia whispered, her voice barely audible. Sarah glanced at Harrow before returning her gaze to Julia. The deaths. All the deaths, Julia. My mother. Those people who vanished in the last few months. It wasn't just random. It was planned. Victor. He orchestrated everything, and he made sure I didn't see it. That's why I had to disappear. Julia's mind spun. Her mother? The people who had been killed? She had assumed the deaths were connected to the affair, to the dangerous people who had been involved, but Sarah was telling her that Victor had orchestrated it all? Harrow's face had gone pale. He took a step forward, his eyes narrowing. What are you saying, Sarah? Are you claiming your father? I'm saying he's responsible for all of it, Sarah cut in, her voice rising. The death of my mother. The people who vanished. Even the whole mess with you, Julia. He had a plan. A sick, twisted plan to control everything. And he dragged you into it, Julia. You had no idea what you were part of. Julia stumbled backward, her hands shaking. Her whole world was shattering again, piece by piece. The affair, the lies, Sarah's betrayal. All of it had been the surface of something far darker. Victor wasn't just a man caught in a web of deceit. He had been pulling strings all along. Julia had been a pawn. Victor's a monster, Sarah continued, her voice firm now, as if she had finally found her footing. And I'm going to make sure he doesn't get away with it. Detective Harrow exchanged a glance with Sarah, then looked back at Julia, as if trying to make sense of the tangled web of truth and lies. You're saying he planned the murders? He asked, his voice grave. Sarah nodded, her expression hardening. I don't have all the evidence yet, but I will. And when I do, my father's going down. Julia stood motionless, the enormity of what Sarah was saying crashing down on her. She had been caught up in a web of lies and manipulation, but none of it had been her choice. None of it had been what she had thought it was. She had been a victim too, but that didn't change what had already happened. What do you want from me? Julia whispered, her voice breaking. Sarah's eyes softened, just for a moment. I don't want anything from you. Not anymore. She paused, as if searching for the right words. But I will never forgive you for what you did. You and my father. Harrow spoke up, his voice low. You two need to get this all out in the open. You have to tell us everything you know. If we're going to bring him down, we need all of it. Julia didn't answer. The weight of everything was too much. How could she help? How could she contribute to fixing the mess that had become her life? Julia, Sarah said one last time, her voice quieter now, but still firm. It's over. And with that, Sarah turned and walked away, leaving Julia standing in the darkness with Detective Harrow, her future uncertain, her past forever tainted by the choices she had made. Julia stood there for what felt like an eternity, her mind numb and heart heavy. Sarah's words echoed in her mind, a constant reminder of the mess she had made of her life. There was no easy way out of this. Even if she somehow managed to explain everything, to clear her conscience, the damage was done. Sarah would never look at her the same way again. The sound of footsteps behind her broke her out of her thoughts. Detective Harrow was still there, standing with her. She hadn't realized how close he had gotten until he spoke, his voice quiet but urgent. "We need to go. The longer you stand here, the more complicated this gets." Julia nodded, but it felt like her legs wouldn't move. She was frozen in place, the weight of Sarah's departure pulling her down. The last thing she wanted to do was go with Harrow, but she knew he was right. She had no choice anymore. The truth had to come out, whether she was ready for it or not. With a shaky breath, she started walking, following Harrow toward the police car parked outside the barn. Every step felt like it took more effort than the last, and her stomach twisted with each movement. The silence between them was deafening. She couldn't bring herself to look at him, let alone speak. What could she possibly say? How could she explain the mess she had been a part of? When they reached the car, Harrow opened the door for her. Julia hesitated for a moment, staring at the seat. It felt like she was walking into a new chapter of her life, one she wasn't ready for. But there was no turning back. "You can sit in the front," Harrow said, breaking the silence, as if sensing her hesitation. "I'll drive." Julia didn't respond, just climbed into the car, trying to keep her hands steady as she buckled her seatbelt. She kept her eyes focused on the dashboard, not daring to look out the window. She didn't want to see the world outside, didn't want to face the reality of everything that had happened. The engine roared to life, and the car slowly pulled away from the barn, taking Julia further from the place that had once been a small corner of comfort, a place where she could pretend things were normal. Now, it was just a reminder of everything she had lost. They drove in silence for what felt like hours, though it was probably only minutes. Harrow kept his eyes on the road, and Julia kept her gaze straight ahead. She had no idea where they were going, but it didn't matter. She was just trying to hold on. "Where are we headed?" Julia finally asked, breaking the silence. Her voice sounded foreign to her, like it belonged to someone else. "We need to get to the station," Harrow answered, his tone even. "You need to make your statement. The sooner we get everything out in the open, the better." Julia swallowed hard. "I don't know if I can do that," she admitted, her voice barely a whisper. "What if they arrest me, Harrow? What if they think I'm responsible for all of this?" Harrow glanced at her briefly before focusing back on the road. "I don't think you're responsible, Julia, but you're tangled in this, and if you want any chance of making things right, you have to tell the truth. The whole truth." Julia nodded, but it felt hollow. She didn't know if telling the truth would make anything better. How could it? Sarah would still hate her. Victor would still be a criminal, and everything she had known would be gone. There was no going back. The drive felt endless, and when they finally reached the police station, Julia felt like she was stepping into another world. The place was cold, sterile, and impersonal. It felt like the walls were closing in on her as they walked through the doors, the buzz of fluorescent lights overhead making her dizzy. Inside, a few officers were typing away at desks, the sound of their keys clacking filling the otherwise quiet room. Harrow led her to an interrogation room, a small, windowless space with a single table and 2 chairs. He gestured for her to sit. "Wait here," he said. "I'll go get the others. They need to hear your statement." Julia nodded, her mind racing. She had no idea what to expect. Would they arrest her? Would they believe her? She sat there for what seemed like an eternity, the seconds dragging by. Her mind kept going back to Sarah and the things she had said. Sarah had blamed her, but was she wrong? Had Julia really been a pawn in all of this? Was she just as much of a victim as Sarah had been? The door swung open, and Harrow returned, followed by 2 other officers. One of them, a tall woman with sharp features, introduced herself as Officer Patterson. The other was a man named Detective Andrews. "We're here to take your statement," Patterson said, her tone businesslike but not unkind. "This is your chance to tell us everything you know." Julia swallowed hard, looking from one officer to the other. There was no more running from this. It was time to face the consequences. "I'll tell you everything," she said quietly, "but I don't think anything I say will change what's already happened." And with that, she began to speak, recounting everything she knew, everything she had been a part of. She told them about the affair, the lies, Victor's role, and Sarah's discovery. She spoke of the things she had seen, the things she had done, and the chaos that had followed. But as she spoke, one question remained unanswered in her mind. Would any of it be enough to undo the damage? The interrogation room felt like it was closing in on Julia as she spoke. The words spilled out of her mouth, her confession coming in waves, each one heavier than the last. Detective Harrow sat across from her, watching closely, his expression unreadable. Officer Patterson and Detective Andrews took notes, their pens scratching across paper, but there was no relief in the process. Nothing would change the fact that she had been caught in the middle of a deadly, twisted game that she never wanted to be a part of. She spoke for hours, detailing the affair, the lies, and how she had been manipulated by Victor. She told them about Sarah's disappearance and how she had found out about everything at the worst possible time. She explained that she had been too afraid to stop, too consumed by guilt and confusion to realize what she had been doing until it was too late. The officers were silent throughout most of it, only asking occasional questions to clarify details. Julia barely noticed them anymore. She was lost in the story of her own ruin, wondering if anything she said could possibly fix what had been broken. When she finished, she sat back in her chair, exhausted, her hands trembling in her lap. The silence in the room was suffocating. "So, Victor orchestrated the whole thing?" Detective Andrews asked, his voice flat. Julia nodded, feeling sick to her stomach. Yes, he had control over everything. The deaths, the disappearances, even what Sarah believed. He made sure she was in the dark about everything. And Sarah? Officer Patterson interjected, her voice sharp. "Do you think she knew?" Julia hesitated, her mind swirling. No, not at first. But when she came back, she started piecing it all together. She realized what he was capable of, and that's when everything started to fall apart. "And now she's gone," Harrow said softly, almost to himself. "Do you think she's in danger?" Julia's heart sank at the question. She hadn't thought about Sarah since their last confrontation. It had been hours, and Sarah hadn't come back. For all Julia knew, Sarah could have gone to the police or, worse, gone straight to Victor to confront him herself. "I don't know," Julia whispered, but she was angry. She wanted revenge. "I wouldn't put it past her to go after him." The room went quiet again, the weight of Julia's words hanging in the air like a thick fog. Detective Harrow leaned forward, his gaze intense. "We need to find her, Julia. She could be a danger to herself, or worse, to someone else." Julia nodded numbly, the pit in her stomach growing deeper. The situation was spiraling even further out of control. The mess she had helped create was growing by the minute. She had no idea where Sarah had gone, but she knew it was only a matter of time before everything collided in an explosion of violence and chaos. Suddenly, the door to the interrogation room slammed open, and the officers standing by the door tensed. "Detective, we have a problem," one of the uniformed officers said, his voice shaky. "We just got a report. It's about Sarah." Julia's blood ran cold at the mention of Sarah's name. She stood up, her chair scraping loudly against the floor. "What happened? Is she okay?" The officer looked at her, his expression grim. "We don't know yet, but she's at Victor's place. We've just gotten word that she broke in. She's armed, and she's demanding to speak with him." Julia's heart pounded in her chest. This was it. Sarah had gone to confront her father, alone, with a weapon. The worst possible scenario was unfolding right before her eyes. "We need to get there," Harrow said, his voice commanding. "Now." Julia didn't even hesitate. She ran for the door, her pulse racing. She had to stop Sarah before it was too late. She knew what kind of person Victor was, what lengths he would go to in order to protect himself. If Sarah confronted him, there was no telling what would happen. As they piled into the squad cars and sped toward Victor's estate, Julia's mind was spinning. She had to get to Sarah. She had to make sure she didn't do something irreversible. The drive felt like it lasted forever, every second dragging with the weight of impending disaster. When they finally arrived at Victor's mansion, the place looked eerily silent. The lights were off in most of the windows, and the large, imposing gates that surrounded the property felt like a prison. "Stay here," Harrow said, turning to Julia as they all piled out of the car. "We'll go in first." Julia shook her head, panic rising in her chest. "No, I'm coming with you. I can't just sit here." "Julia," Harrow started, but Julia cut him off, her voice shaking with desperation. "I know what she's like. I know what she'll do if she's cornered. Please, let me help." Harrow hesitated, but finally gave a reluctant nod. "All right. Stick close and stay calm." They moved quickly toward the house, the sound of their footsteps muffled on the gravel driveway. The air was thick with tension as they reached the front door, and Julia could hear shouting from inside. The door was slightly ajar, and through the crack, she could make out Sarah's voice, raised in anger. "You've ruined everything, Dad." Sarah screamed from inside. "You're a monster, and I won't let you get away with it." Julia's heart sank. This was it. If she didn't stop Sarah now, the consequences could be deadly. With a glance from Harrow, they all pushed through the door, weapons drawn, ready for whatever came next. Julia, Detective Harrow, and the officers arrive at Victor's house, where Sarah is very upset and holding a gun, ready to confront her father. Sarah wants to make Victor pay for the bad things he's done, but Julia is scared and tries to stop her from doing something dangerous. The sound of gunfire rang out like thunder in the middle of a quiet, moonless night. Julia Collins, dressed in nothing but a blood-soaked nightgown, ran across the yard of her best friend's family estate, her heart pounding with every step. She could still hear the screams echoing behind her, the chaos and confusion lingering in the air. The moonlight barely lit her way, but she didn't care. She had to get away. Behind her, in the grand house, her best friend, Sarah, lay lifeless on the marble floor, a single bullet hole in her chest. Sarah's father, Victor Mathis, was in the living room, slumped over, clutching his bleeding stomach, gasping for air. And in the midst of it all, Julia stood. Her hands trembling, her heart racing, her mind a blur. How did it all come to this? Julia's mind flashed back to when everything had started, to when she and Victor first crossed the line. She remembered how it all seemed so thrilling at first. The secret moments shared under the cover of darkness, their stolen kisses and whispered promises. It was supposed to be a temporary escape from her life, something thrilling, forbidden, but she never imagined it would end like this. The firelight from the living room flickered behind her as she glanced back, half expecting Victor to be following her. But there was no one, only the terrifying silence. Julia's breath came in shallow gasps as she reached the edge of the estate, her mind racing with questions she couldn't answer. Was it over? Was she going to be caught? Her phone buzzed in her pocket, pulling her from the fog of panic. It was a message from Sarah. "I know what you did. Meet me at the old barn tonight." Her fingers shook as she typed back, trying to calm herself enough to sound convincing. "I don't know what you're talking about. What happened?" But before she could hit send, a sudden scream pierced the night, sending a cold chill down her spine. It was a woman's voice, distant yet unmistakable. Julia froze in terror. Was it Sarah? Was she still alive? Her phone buzzed again, but this time it was a call. It was Victor. She stared at the screen for a long moment, the name burning in her mind like a warning. She wanted to answer, but part of her was terrified of what he might say. The scream came again, this time much closer. Julia turned around. Her heart skipped a beat. She could make out a figure in the distance, tall, dark, moving fast toward her. Victor. Her body screamed at her to run, but her feet wouldn't move. Her legs felt like they were made of lead. And then the silence that had gripped the night was shattered by another gunshot. Victor's voice, calm and chilling, cut through the tension. "Julia, you can't run from what we've done." Her hands trembled as she took a step back, almost stumbling into the darkness. The barn. That's where it had all started. She had to get there, to understand how this madness had come to be. She didn't know whether she was trying to escape or to face whatever was coming. The figure was getting closer. "Victor." What have you done? Julia shouted into the night. And then, as if in answer, the figure froze. Her breath caught in her throat. Was it him? Had he followed her out here? The figure took a step forward, and for the first time, Julia could clearly see the outline of a gun in his hand. The gunshot rang out just as she turned to run, and her world exploded into darkness. Julia's eyes fluttered open, and for a moment, she thought she was dreaming. The world around her was a blur, a dark haze of shapes and shadows. Her head throbbed painfully as she tried to sit up, but her body refused to obey. She felt dizzy, disoriented, and cold. She tried to remember what had happened, but everything seemed to be slipping away like water through her fingers. The gunshot, the figure in the distance, Victor's voice. Slowly, she blinked her eyes into focus, realizing she was lying in the dirt behind the barn, hidden from view. The barn door was slightly ajar, and she could hear the faint sound of footsteps, slow, deliberate, as if someone was searching for her. She held her breath and tried to listen more closely. The footsteps were faint but unmistakable. Was it Victor? Or had someone else found her? The gunshot, the scream, was it real? Was Sarah really gone? Julia's stomach churned as a wave of nausea hit her. She didn't want to believe it, but everything was pointing toward a terrible truth. Julia sat up carefully, wincing at the sharp pain in her side. She was bleeding. Her gown, once white, was now stained with dark red spots. Her fingers trembled as she touched the wound, trying to stop the bleeding. She had to keep moving. She had to find a way out of this nightmare. Her heart raced as she struggled to her feet, using the barn wall for support. The world around her seemed to spin, but she pushed through it. She couldn't afford to waste time. Someone was coming. The footsteps were closer now. She glanced over her shoulder, her breath catching in her throat as she saw a shadow move in the distance. It was a figure, a man, standing just outside the barn, his face obscured by the darkness. Julia froze, her heart thumping loudly in her chest. Could it be Victor? Or someone else looking for her? The figure stepped forward, revealing his face. It was a man Julia didn't recognize. Tall, with a dark beard and piercing eyes. He didn't look friendly. He looked dangerous. Julia's mind raced. She couldn't let him catch her. She had no idea what he wanted, but she could guess it wasn't good. Her hand reached instinctively for the knife she had hidden in her waistband. It wasn't much of a weapon, but it was all she had. The man took another step forward, his eyes scanning the area. Julia's heart skipped a beat. She had to act fast. With a deep breath, she sprinted toward the back of the barn, hoping the man wouldn't hear her. She was almost there when a voice called out from behind her. "Stop. I'm not here to hurt you." Julia's body froze. Her instincts screamed at her to run, but she hesitated. She didn't know who this man was or what he wanted, but there was something about his voice that seemed sincere. She turned around slowly, her grip tightening on the knife. "Who are you?" The man raised his hands, trying to show he meant no harm. "I'm not here to hurt you, I promise. My name's Detective John Harrow. I'm with the local police." Julia narrowed her eyes, still not convinced. "You're lying. I swear." "I'm not," Harrow said, his voice steady. "We're trying to figure out what happened here. I'm not your enemy. I'm trying to help you." Julia took a step back, weighing her options. She could run, but she was exhausted and injured. She couldn't outrun him, but could she trust him? Before she could decide, the sound of another voice echoed through the barn. "Harrow, what the hell is going on here?" Julia's heart lurched as she recognized the voice. It was Victor, and he was close. Too close. Victor's voice was like a cold blade, slicing through the tense silence between Julia and Detective Harrow. Her breath caught in her throat as she spun around to face him, the blood pounding in her ears. "Victor," she whispered, her voice shaking. He stood in the doorway of the barn, his tall figure silhouetted against the dim moonlight. His shirt was stained with blood, his face pale, and his hand was clutching his stomach where the bullet had torn through his flesh. He didn't look like the man she had known, the man she had shared stolen moments with, the man who had seemed so in control, so powerful. He looked broken now. "Julia, you don't have to do this," Victor said. His voice strained but filled with an undeniable edge. Come with me. We can still fix this. Her heart twisted, her mind a whirlpool of confusion and fear. Fix this? How could anything be fixed after everything that had happened? After what she had done, what they had done? The truth was crashing down on her, and she didn't know how to survive it. You shot her, Julia said, her voice trembling as she looked at Victor. You killed Sarah. Victor's lips twisted into something between a grimace and a sneer. I didn't kill Sarah. She got in the way. She was going to ruin everything. Everything? Julia repeated, her voice cracking. You've ruined everything, Victor. Victor's eyes narrowed. You think this was just about her? About Sarah? No, Julia. This was about us. You and me. This was about getting out of that hellhole. We could have had everything, but she was too much of a threat. She was always in the way. Julia shook her head, tears welling in her eyes. She felt like she was suffocating. I never wanted any of this. I never wanted. She cut herself off, her body trembling as the weight of the words she couldn't bring herself to say hung in the air. Victor's gaze softened, and for a fleeting moment, he seemed like the man she had fallen for, the man who had made her feel special, wanted. But that moment was gone as quickly as it came. His face hardened again, and he took a step toward her. Julia, please, come with me. We can leave this behind. We can start over. Julia's hands shook as she clutched the knife tighter, her thoughts racing. The blood on her gown felt like a weight, a symbol of all the lies, the betrayal, the dark path they had walked together. But was it too late to turn back? Could she really leave all of this behind? Before she could speak, Detective Harrow's voice cut through the tension. Victor, I need you to stop right there. You're not going anywhere. Victor's eyes flickered with annoyance, and he reached inside his jacket, his fingers brushing against the grip of a gun. Julia's heart raced. This was it. This was the moment she had been dreading. No, Detective, Victor said, his voice eerily calm. I think you're the one who needs to leave. The sound of metal clicking echoed through the barn as Victor pulled out the gun, pointing it straight at Harrow. Victor, Julia shouted, panic seizing her chest. Please, don't do this. Victor didn't respond. His gaze was cold, calculating. He was done talking. And that's when Julia saw it, the look in his eyes. The look that told her he was beyond reason, beyond redemption. There was no turning back now. Harrow's hand moved quickly, reaching for his own weapon, but Victor was faster. The gunshot rang out, loud and sharp, the sound shattering the silence like glass. Harrow staggered backward, a look of disbelief crossing his face as he collapsed to the ground, blood pooling beneath him. Julia's world spun. Everything slowed. Time felt like it had stopped as she stared at the lifeless body of the man who had been trying to help her. Victor's eyes didn't leave hers. He lowered the gun, his expression unreadable. You see, Julia, it was never about Sarah. It was about us. You and me. She couldn't breathe. The weight of everything, her actions, her choices, the blood on her hands, crushed her. Victor, why? She whispered, the word barely escaping her lips. Victor took a step toward her, his voice soft but chilling. Because you're mine, Julia, and I always get what I want. Suddenly, the barn door swung open, and another figure appeared in the doorway. A woman, a familiar woman. It was Sarah. Julia is shocked to see that Sarah, whom she thought was dead, is alive and standing in front of them. Sarah confronts her father, Victor, revealing that she had survived and had overheard Julia's confession. Sarah is furious with both Julia and Victor, accusing them of betraying her. Julia tries to explain, but Sarah harshly rejects her, expressing how much she has lost because of their actions. Victor attempts to control the situation, but Sarah refuses to listen to him anymore. As tensions rise between the two, police officers suddenly enter the barn, arresting Victor. Julia is left stunned and unsure of what just happened, realizing that the nightmare is far from over. The police surrounded Victor, pulling him to his feet as he struggled against their grip. His face twisted with disbelief, his eyes darting from officer to officer, as though searching for a way out. But there was no escape now. Julia watched, frozen in place, as the scene unfolded before her. She could barely comprehend what had just happened. "Let go of me," Victor growled, his voice thick with anger. "You have no idea who you're dealing with. I'll make sure you all regret this." Sarah stepped forward, her expression unwavering. "It's over, Dad. You're not in control anymore." The officers didn't flinch at Victor's threats. They were professionals, trained to handle situations like this. One of them, a tall man with short cropped hair, spoke to Sarah. She wanted to tell him that she wasn't okay, that she didn't know what to feel anymore. Everything had spiraled out of control so quickly, and now, standing there, she felt like a stranger in her own life. "We'll take him from here," the officer said to Sarah, signaling for his partner to lead Victor away. As the officers began to escort him toward the waiting squad car, Julia's gaze met Sarah's once more. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The weight of everything hung between them. The betrayal, the lies, the deaths. Sarah had every right to hate her, to never want to speak to her again. But still, Julia couldn't help the faint hope that flickered in her chest, that somehow they could find a way to fix this, to rebuild the trust they had lost. Finally, Sarah broke the silence. Her voice was softer now, quieter, but still filled with a deep sorrow. "You should have stayed away, Julia. You should have never gotten involved." "I know," Julia whispered, the guilt suffocating her. "I didn't mean for any of this to happen. I swear." But Sarah just shook her head. "It doesn't matter now." Her eyes, so full of pain, met Julia's one last time. "Everything's ruined. You can't fix it." With that, Sarah turned and walked away, disappearing into the shadows of the night. Julia wanted to call after her, to beg for forgiveness, but she knew it was pointless. There was no going back now. The damage was done. The sound of the police car doors slamming shut echoed in the quiet night, signaling the end of an era. The events that had started so innocently, with stolen moments and whispered promises, had led to this: betrayal, murder, and the destruction of everything Julia once held dear. As the car drove away, taking Victor with it, Julia stood alone in the darkness, the weight of her choices crushing her. The nightmare wasn't over. It was just beginning. The night air felt heavier now, almost suffocating, as Julia stood in the empty barn. Her legs felt weak beneath her, and she sank to the ground, her back pressed against the cold wall. She tried to catch her breath, but every inhalation felt like it was laced with dread. Her mind raced, replaying every moment leading up to this. The lies, the secret affair with Victor, the fatal mistake that had brought Sarah back from the dead, and now, the wreckage of everything she had ever known. Her hands trembled as she wiped away the tears that had silently begun to fall. She didn't know who she was anymore. The Julia she once knew, the girl who could laugh and feel light, seemed like a distant memory. She had betrayed her best friend. She had betrayed herself. The sound of footsteps startled her, and she looked up to see Detective Harrow, the same man who had been shot earlier, standing at the edge of the barn. He was leaning heavily on a crutch, his shirt stained with blood from the wound he had sustained, but his expression was determined, cold even. "Detective, you're alive," Julia managed to say, her voice hoarse. Harrow gave a short nod. "Barely, but I'm here." He hobbled toward her, pausing only when he was close enough to speak in a low voice. "You've got a lot to answer for, Julia." Julia's heart sank. She knew what he meant. After all, her fingerprints were all over this disaster. "I didn't do it," she said, her words rushed. "I didn't kill anyone. I wasn't the one who—" "I know," Harrow interrupted, holding up a hand, "but you're tangled up in this mess. You were part of it, and that makes you a part of the investigation." Julia's stomach twisted in knots. She wasn't a criminal. She never wanted to be involved in any of this. But there was no escaping the truth. She had been part of the lies, part of the cover-ups, part of the betrayal. It was too late to pretend she was innocent. Harrow crouched down next to her, his gaze softening slightly. "You need to come with me, Julia. You need to tell your side of the story. It's the only way you can clear your conscience." Her breath caught in her throat. She wanted to scream, to deny everything, but she knew deep down that she couldn't. She couldn't lie her way out of this one. Not anymore. I don't know what to say, she whispered, her voice breaking. I never wanted any of this to happen. Harrow sighed, a weary expression crossing his face. You can't change what's already happened, but you can still control how you move forward. You have to face the truth. You have to tell us everything. For a moment, Julia just sat there, staring at the floor, the weight of Harrow's words pressing down on her. She was trapped in a nightmare, one she couldn't escape, and she didn't know how much longer she could hold it all together. Finally, she nodded, her voice barely audible. Okay, I'll come with you. Harrow extended a hand to help her up, and as she took it, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was already too far gone. But there was no turning back. The police had already arrested Victor. Sarah had walked away, and Julia had no idea if they would ever speak again.